Hi IronHackers, welcome to our second tutorial on Design Foundations. My name is Marlene Proman and I'm a PhD student at the Research Center of Open Digital Innovation at Purdue University. In the last session we already covered design elements. So in this tutorial, you will be introduced to design principles with which to organize your design elements in your mashups. Principles of design are not rules that need to be followed, but rather concepts. They are based on perceptual psychology that can be strategically used to achieve specific visual effects. So from the previous tutorial, you should already be familiar with harmony and variety. But this session will go further and discuss the concepts of balance, proportion, emphasis, contrast, pattern, rhythm, and structure. There is a high level of overlap in terms of how these principles function, but for simplicity's sake, we'll go through each one of them so that you can be cognizant of their effects in your mashup designs. And we'll continue with the poppy field example to discuss which design principles have informed the relationships between the design elements in this visual design. So let's revise the principle of harmony. In both of these examples, it is the similarity in how the data points are represented that trigger the visual perception of repetition and constancy. Also, both of these examples carry the same colors across the entire composition. This high similarity across the different areas of the composition and the different features of the composition unifies the visual language and therefore creates visually pleasing designs. But too much harmony is what you should know from the first tutorial. Indeed, it can be boring for people. So what makes this web page harmonious? Well, first off, the heavily centralized data visualization of the poppies on strings that dynamically flow across the page. And despite the data asymmetry between high human loss in the early wars and less but longer wars in the second half of the visualization sphere, despite this asymmetry, their unified style and rightward direction works to unify the scene. And then there is the heavy reliance on monochromatic red hues that tie the different elements into a composition. So the same colors as the poppies are used also to color in the filters that are correlated with the poppy petals, and also timeline is using red, which again is unifying across the different elements into a unifying composition. But less obviously, the strongly horizontal orientation of the timeline, but also the other features, conveys balance and stability, which can be associated with harmony rather than variety, for instance. So counterpart to harmony is variety, which is commonly achieved through the use of many different elements and or applying the principles of rhythm and contrast. So the use of very different and contrasting colors, for instance, causes the high perceived variety in this visual design. It creates excitement, but if overused can cause chaos, and especially so in the web design context, where it can overwhelm and confuse people. So what gives variety to this relatively harmonious composition? There is an asymmetry that is across the horizontal axis of this page. So the top half of the page has a high negative space and buttons that are clustered in either of the two corners, while the bottom half of the page is dense with visual elements and throughout the horizontal landscape, and it has one centralized timeline rather than buttons that fill the corners. So essentially, they are opposite, but yet they are balancing each other out in this kind of a V structure. Vertically cut the left side is dominated by two major poppies, poppies, and which also have varying hues in terms of not various hues of reds, and of course they counterbalance the high density of these lines on the right hand side. And buttons and grays versus black is also varied in this design, although smaller detail, but here you do see variance in terms of how something is emphasized or not, and similarly the social media buttons. Balance or the impression of equality among the visual elements can be achieved by playing with visual weight, so how heavy or light something is perceived in terms of gravity, or visual importance in terms of how prominent it is in the visual scene or on the page. So bigger size and higher contrast elements tend to be more prominent than others. So how is balance used in this composition? So an obvious element that has high visual balance internally is the poppy icon. It uses the same shape over and over and over, despite the transparency layers. But it creates this compound shape that is rather symmetrical and therefore very balanced across the different axes that you can potentially draw through it. However, their aggregate composition has variety, yet it remains balanced because the two visual items on the left-hand side are balanced by the high density of the lines of the threads on the right-hand side. Also, balance is conveyed by the two handles of the timetable, for instance. They are both conveyed at an equal height, and both can equally be used to control the timeline and therefore the visualization. Similarly, balance is preserved between these three clusters. So imagine if this was also down here, for instance, then two elements, one long and short, would not quite balance these location filters, but two shorter ones kind of do balance the one very long one. Next up is the principle of proportion, which is the relative size relationship between two or more elements, and it's a very effective tool for conveying difference. And of course, in this poppy field, we have again the poppy petals that have effectively used proportion to convey the human loss of the different wars, and of course the world wars stand out a great deal here. Though note that not always is relative size an intentional emphasizing or an intentional goal to emphasize one element over another. So here North America and South America are just optimized to, due to their lengthy wording, they are longer and therefore visually more prominent. But you should just acknowledge the fact that proportional variance has the power to guide users to some elements over another. So just be cognizant of this potential effect as you design your mashups. And so we get to emphasis. It is used to guide user attention in a composition by conveying dominance or focal point, or oftentimes an anomaly. While visual weight can be achieved by many different ways, contrast and large proportions, as you can see here, are by far the two most dominant tactics to achieve it. So in this poppy field case, again, large item, highest contrast. The poppy of the World War II definitely is the focal point of this composition. And then if we talk about contrast, it is the primary method of highlighting elements and drawing our attention to them. So it conveys the difference between elements and creates visual interest, as well as focal points. So after we have noticed these two, our eye immediately moves on to the other high contrast elements in the visual composition. So we are drawn to the controls with which we can then interact with the data visualization. So it's a well-designed composition in that sense. And then other elements are kind of far more subdued, they're dulled down and far paler and do not cry out for attention as much because they are not as crucial. So drawing this balance and identifying what you want the user to focus on early on, and then designing them to stand out, to be emphasized, to have high contrast, is a design strategy that you definitely should leverage, so that to fluently guide your users through your web mashups without getting them lost. Another interesting design principle is pattern, or in layman's terms, a visual beat. It's a systematic and repetitive use or arrangement of visual elements in a composition. Or it can also be across the user's journey, so in the different web pages of a website or across the different branded items, such as a pen or a logo on a letterhead, and etc. So think of a branded clothing store, for instance, where everything communicates the same essence of that brand and the image it wants to convey and sell. So patterns can be formed by altering, repeating, or recurring the elements in exact or varied ways. So here we have two examples where the visualizations essentially leverage patterns, and they're different, and the color coding and shape variants are used to draw out the differences. In the poppy field example, pattern emerges from the short, under a year-long wars, but also from the overall trend line that wars and how wars have changed over the years, namely that there are more wars today, but they carry a relatively lower cost in human life. But what this design does well is that it doesn't quite go on to suggest that this doesn't matter. They have used the high emphasis on the poppies to really highlight the loss as a bright color, so that it really trickles through. And for this reason, pattern is perhaps one of the more important design principles to be used when designing data visualizations. But also rhythm or movement, which is the perception of motion or a sense of direction in a visual scene. And this is important to kind of draw out the path along which the user can go on a journey. So in the poppy field example, the fact that there's this movement towards right, because we read from left to right, there's the movement towards future. So it kind of also poses perhaps a moral question, like what do we want our futures to be? Do we want less and shorter wars with even less human casualties, and so forth? So design is a powerful language for conveying meaning. But other elements like the timeline handles or the drop-down arrow also convey the potential for movement, and herein it's the actual movement that the user can take. So to slide the handles or to offer a drop-down menu. whereas these buttons are relatively speaking static. But even the jumpy scales guides our eye to grasp the different lengths of the word. So it's kind of the bigger sizes trickling down to shorter is also carrying a sense of motion. And lastly, the hierarchy of any visual scene guides the user through by giving a clear starting point. And so here it's guided by the headline, and then following through the thread, the user can actually kind of see the journey that they are embarking on. So Skype, for instance, doesn't have a threaded response capability, while Facebook does, which allows users to kind of enter into sub conversations, which makes it much easier to follow what others are saying and which conversation to become part of. So it's an important usability feature, and without hierarchy, you're bound to have your users get lost on your site. So this puppy field actually has prioritized data very much over anything else, and this is because really it already has a introduction page that it used to introduce the title, and through its subpages it also introduced the visual parameters in terms of how to read this data visualization. So with this, I conclude the second tutorial on usability. In this video, we covered the design principles. So now you're able to follow these or apply these in combining design elements in different ways towards different effects. The next tutorial and the last one will introduce you to the user-centered design approach that helps you focus on the end user and on the usability heuristics. And these will help you leverage your new design skills to achieve easy-to-use mashups that your users will enjoy. With that, thank you for listening, and move on to the next usability tutorial.